Hi, everyone. I am Mark from Samaritan's Well Counseling, and today we have a special guest. It's Lana Bagley, and she's an LPC supervisor, and she's got a website, lanabagleycounseling.com, and we'll show you how to connect with her later. She also has a nonprofit called Whole Reach Ministry, and so I'd love to hear more about that, Lana, maybe towards the end. We're talking about trauma today, specifically post-traumatic stress disorder, or all the forms, all the things related to processing trauma and healing from trauma, which is a big term, a big word. But Lana, welcome, and tell us a little bit about your experience in working with trauma.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me on. So I got thrown into, if you will, a little bit of a situation where I ended up seeing a gamut of clients with schizophrenia.
Okay.
And so I kind of became like, if you had schizophrenia, that I was going to be who you saw at at the clinic that I worked at.
Okay.
And in that situation, there was a lot of trauma with that. We also were seeing VA kind of combat and issues. And so there was a lot of trauma that was coming up over and over and over again, right? And so as I continued to kind of excel with seeing a lot of those patients, then you just start to see them, right? So that's just what continues to come and come and come. I do see a lot of people with trauma. I will say a lot of people do have trauma, but I tend to see the cases that are a little bit more of the complex trauma. And so those are people that we know have PTSD, but it's complex because it typically was happening for a long period of time, and the abuse and harm that happened was happening over the course of many different ways, right? So psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and often that starts in childhood. And so it's not until, it's great if we can kind of maybe get to some of these kids whenever these things are happening, but so much of that is not coming up, and they're not able to get to a place where they have safety in order to talk about these things until they're adults. So that's a bulk of what I see nowadays.
Would you say, Lana, would you kind of define complex trauma then is if there's like multiple streams of trauma or sources and it goes on over time, that in general is a complex trauma?
Yes, I would. So the way that we kind of break down trauma is we say that there's either acute trauma, prolonged trauma, or complex trauma, right? So when we think about acute trauma, that's going to be more of maybe like a sudden death with a car accident. It's going to be something that was really unexpected. Maybe it was a assault, that happened out of the blue type of thing. So those are what we call acute. Now, I am not saying that an acute trauma is any less, difficult or difficult to deal with, but there are just differences, right? And then like the prolonged, that would be a longer situation. So maybe somebody is stuck in a very, toxic, abusive relationship for, years and years and years. Okay, well then we can see kind of the prolonged, right? Then yes, after that, it's kind of like we have the complex, where the complex kind of adds in a lot of both, actually, where like there's things that's unexpected that are happening that they didn't expect, but then there's also the prolonged and the consistent that's happening along the way.
Tell us a little bit about kind of how you approach that these days. After your experience, you started off working with a lot of schizophrenia, and then you did some PTSD from like veterans and things like that. How do you approach it like today if someone comes in, and maybe you could give an example of a type of trauma and kind of the way you approach it, the way you jump in with them?
Well, so that's always going to be something that I'm going to assess for, right? And intake is, please share with me any trauma, right? But I tend to also say, any sexual abuse, any, intense bullying, any, have you been involved in any, major losses, major disasters, right? Like, so there's all these other things that people just don't always think about. Even significant, very difficult relationships, right? So when we're asking all of those things, and if I can see they're like, yes, that, then I know, okay, hey, listen, you've got some trauma there. Now, just because someone has trauma does not mean that they have PTSD. So
Correct. Okay.
the
That's good.
trauma is something good to be aware of, but we want to see, hey, how then did this person's body and brain respond to this traumatic event? So traumatic events can happen. You and I could be in a car accident, and you could come out totally fine, and I could come out and then ultimately have PTSD later on from it, right?
Sure. Sure.
So there are some precursors that can kind of tell us maybe who would be more likely to continue on after a trauma and have maybe PTSD. And we can talk about that later. But that's what we're going to look for is, okay, is the trauma there? And then what does the person even think about these traumas? Are they like, oh, I don't remember any of those things? Like, oh, that was just a long time ago. Because we
that
know
happened a long time ago.
we know these things do matter, right? Because and the reason why PTSD and trauma is so different from all of these other kind of mental health issues is that it does change the brain, right?
Yes.
It rewires us. And so it changes our central nervous system. It puts us in this heightened state of hypervigilance. It places us in, you've heard this a lot, but that fight, flight, or freeze, we can't get out of that as easy. And so there's a lot of things that change with that people don't necessarily understand and know that can come back to trauma. So we try to assess there and start there, if that makes sense.
And that makes a lot of sense. Lana, as we're talking about kind of how you approach it, which is a really good start already, but do you find that, do you have a number of people that will come in and maybe they minimize something? It could be something the whole family went through, a car crash or a sudden death of mom or, the grandparent or whatever it might be. And maybe for different reasons, it could be because, oh, we all went through that, or it didn't seem like it affected me much then. Do you find that a lot of trauma is like buried? It's like blocked off?
Yes. Yes, I do think that a lot of trauma is buried. And I will say that there's also probably multiple reasons for that. Especially when we're talking about childhood trauma, the brain's job is to protect us, right? And when something horrific has happened and we are young and we cannot understand it and put all the pieces together, the brain will often shut that out.
Like encapsulated, right? I kind of tell people it's like whoosh, it gets wrapped up and kind of put away.
It doesn't disappear,
right.
But it does that, but then we also know that the body remembers. So the body has the ability to probably give away more ultimately than what we can recall most of the time. And so a lot of people are coming into me, trying to see providers, and they're like, well, I feel so stressed all the time, or I'm irritable. I can never sleep. I have this, I have that, well, have you ever had any trauma? Did anything happen? Well, yeah, but like, I really don't even remember it. It didn't seem like it was a big deal, I don't, my brother was killed and, but we all just kind of moved on, and like, we know he's in a better place. And so, and it's like, well, how old were you when your brother was killed? Well, I was 5, well, that's kind of tough,
That's pretty tough at 5.
And so, so we know it's like, okay, that the body is now trying to tell us it's struggling with this and it wants to go back and find a way to kind of now reconcile what it couldn't at 5.
Yeah. I had a friend of mine, and I've got a lot of clients like this, but a friend of mine told me, in 5th grade, he witnessed something really traumatic with one of his best friends. Now, fortunately, his friend survived and everything, so it turned out well. But it was so traumatic that it was completely blocked out to him from 5th grade until 28 years old. He was literally doing something that almost reproduced the same scenario at 28. Unknowingly, and all of a sudden he had that flashback of exactly what had happened that day.
Wow.
And it's not always that profound, but sometimes it is, right? I always tell my clients, it's okay to bury something, but we just don't bury it alive. And I think a lot of our trauma work is things that have not really been buried properly. They've been put aside with things like, oh, well, it was his time to go, or God needed another angel, or these Christianese trite things maybe, or sometimes you're in a family where you just can't grieve, for example. And or if you take like a veteran, they had so much coming at them in a lot of these scenarios that it was impossible to deal with it at the time, in a sense, without just, blocking it off,
Yeah.
But
Yep.
yeah, tell us a little more about your approach as that comes in. So we know that part of this is just recognizing if there's a trauma that's actually having an effect, that we're actually, get to the point of helping them recognize it, and then what's the next step?
Right. So it's it's hard because a lot of times whenever they're coming in because they are not stable, right? So we
Right.
can maybe
Right.
see, okay, they have PTSD. They do need to do this trauma work.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes it takes a bit to get there where you can do the trauma work, right?
That's true.
And part of what we also know with trauma and PTSD is that, you know, part of the difficulty is that it's really made the brain not feel like this is a safe space, right? Like the
Yes.
world that we live in is not safe.
Dangerous, right?
And so
Dangerous.
even whenever they know they want to try to come and have help and get help, it can take a really long time for that trust to be built, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, of course they want to feel better right away and they want things to be good, but you do really have to kind of like sit in it with them, build up that
Right.
rapport, build trust
Right.
with them so that they can see like, okay, hey, we're going to do this. And then I think we
Mm-hmm.
are trying to establish some safety measures first, right? So
Good.
grounding, making sure that they are safe in the environment that
Mm-hmm.
they are in. That is the other thing.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, the trauma that happened, that was something that was not safe. It violated them or violated their boundaries, or there was a major loss there. Safety was gone. So if they are in a stage of their life where they are unsafe, we're not going to be able to do that work. So sometimes we really just have to work on, hey, the first thing that we need to do here is create safety in your life.
Sure. To have that foundation, right, you have to have a starting point. It's almost like a home base or something, right? Get some stability under your feet now before we try to go back and work on anything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And then once that's there, and I feel like they are in a stable place, then a lot of times we are trying to have conversations about, okay, what triggers have you noticed? Right. So we're not necessarily even saying anything totally with, specifically to the trauma, but I might just be like, hey, over the course of the time, like, knowing you had this, are there any triggers that you feel like you are aware of or aren't aware of for yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Because
Okay.
they're there, right?
Sure.
Again, that's kind of the body and the brain's way of kind of giving us those check engine lights, right? So it's like, yeah, you're going to have those triggers when that trauma got encoded into the brain, into our hippocampus, right?
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
took in all the stimuli around it. And so we know, so when those
Like a
stimuli,
snapshot,
that's
right?
right.
It's just like whoosh, the whole snapshot.
That's right. So it takes it all in. And so we're not necessarily saying that the song that was playing is a horrible song or awful or that song's going to hurt you. But if that song was playing whenever, you got into that horrific car accident and someone died, that song now would be a trigger, right? And
Absolutely.
so when we can understand like, oh, these are some of those things. Some people don't understand what those triggers are or why, or they just think, well, that's my trigger and that's the way it'll always be.
Sure.
So
Sure.
understanding what the triggers are, how they came to be, again, then we kind of can look for, this depends on the type of therapy that you want to do too. There's several
Sure.
effective therapies for PTSD, so it really does depend on what avenue you want to go, what the person maybe has tried before.
Mm-hmm.
But you can do cognitive processing therapy. That's more like CBT type of therapy. You can do prolonged exposure therapy. So in other words, in
Mm-hmm.
that example I just gave, we might then sit in my office and I'll say, okay, so I'm going to play the song that played
Mm-hmm.
whenever that happened.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's take some deep breaths, right? I'm going to start the
Mm-hmm.
song. We're just going to maybe do 30 seconds of it, or you can tell me to stop if we need to before then,
Sure.
and then we're going to stop it. And then we're going to see, how are they feeling? Where are they feeling anxious, stress, right? Like, what did that do to the body, right? So we're trying to
Sure.
then kind of connect in all these things to see, like, what is this looking like? And that also can
Mm-hmm.
kind of help them understand, oh, wow. So that's how triggers work. And that's how then my brain and my body start to navigate with it. So a lot of it is educational based too.
That's good. I tell people in general, if you want to know the big picture of what triggers tell us, it tells us we need to dig here. Have you kind of found
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
Because if I'm being triggered, I need to find out how I'm being triggered, and where
That's right.
that's coming from. And I have always used, you could say, a type of exposure therapy combined with prayer, because I find that we have to go back to that place. And I always think about one of the places I think about trauma, believe it or not, is in John 21, where Jesus is there on the shore, and he's got a fire of coals, and Peter comes up. He's all excited when he comes in from the ship, but he sees the fire of coals. And there's only one other place that fire of coals is mentioned in the scripture. It's in John 18, where Peter was warming himself around a fire of coals before he denied Jesus those 3 times. So to me, that clearly is Jesus taking him back to the trauma. And then, of course, he asks him those 3 times, similar to the 3 times he denied. And it's a longer story, but I do think that part of that is what we're talking about. In a very real sense, we have to go back. And I think that one of the things that I find so often is we have to go beyond how you initially feel toward yourself. Let's say it's that 11-year-old that, suddenly lost mom. It was a terrible trauma. And how do you feel towards that 11-year-old when we go back to that funeral or whatever the scene is? Maybe when you found out or you're in the hospital room, it's a terrible trauma, but it could fit with any kind of trauma. And initially, what I find is they'll say, well, I feel sorry for her. Nobody should have to go through that. But I found out a long time ago that you have to dig a little deeper. I'll go, well, that's so good. What else do you feel towards her? And I think that typically, if you dig a little deeper, well, she should have cried it out, or she shouldn't have cried as much, or she should have done this, or she shouldn't have done that. And I found that one of the keys to resolving trauma or working towards healing is dealing with that self-judgment and that self-contempt against yourself. What are your thoughts about that, either generally or specifically, or maybe with a story or something?
Yeah. I mean, I think that when we look at these situations, it's so easy for us to try to find a sense of control with the
Mm-hmm.
trauma and however it happened, right? And in trying to find control, we often then try to find a way to blame ourselves and take responsibility
Yes.
and ownership for things that
Yes.
we should not take responsibility and ownership for, right?
Right.
And so a lot of times we're looking at that in terms of like, okay, are you feeling or carrying guilt or
Mm-hmm.
shame about this, right?
Yes.
And often the answer is yes. And so then whenever
Yes.
we can kind of then break down those things and say, okay, well, look here. Guilt
Mm-hmm.
is wrongdoing. So
Mm-hmm.
let's talk about it. What
Mm-hmm.
wrongdoing do you think that you did in this scenario?
Right.
You were 5. That
Right.
person was 26. What wrongdoing do you think, right? Like, so again,
Sure.
trying to help them understand, like, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't feel, but I do feel shame, right? And here's the deal. There is healthy shame, but there's toxic shame too. And a
Right.
lot of people fall into toxic shame, right? And so the
Mm-hmm.
difference of those two things, there's kind of okay, I made a mistake, healthy shame. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I can do better next time. Toxic shame, I am a mistake.
I am a mistake. I think a toxic shame is condemnation. Healthy shame we would call conviction. Maybe it's like, oh, do something different next time.
That's right.
I
That's right.
agree with you. Versus condemnation. And we understand Romans chapter 8 says there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. But back to what we're talking about, one way or another, we have to help them to reconcile with that part of themselves that went through the trauma. It could be through some understanding. I like to think about us as just ministers of reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times I will just take it simple. Instead of maybe explaining things, which can be helpful, I will just say, well, if you're holding that against her for crying too much or not crying enough or whatever, will you forgive her?
That's right.
Will you release that judgment against her? A lot of times I'll say, think about it as your little sister or your little brother. Would you forgive him eventually? I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
has been 37 years, so maybe it's time, we might, it
Right.
could be something like that.
Right.
But that part of it, like going back to the trauma, because it's not resolved, right? I remember a psychiatrist was telling me this story from years ago. He had someone in the program he was working at she was in her 30s, I think, and she'd been depressed literally like for a decade. So they just couldn't get to the bottom of it. And he was a Christian, and it was like a Christian program. So he said, let's pray and ask God to give you a dream to find out where this depression is coming from. And so she said, okay. So they prayed, and the next day they come back, and he goes, well, did you get a dream? And she was a little upset. She says, no, I didn't have a dream. He said, well, I had a dream. And she goes, really? Yeah, I had a dream that you had an abortion, and that's what's causing this depression. Have you ever had an abortion? Well, yeah, I had an abortion, but I promise you, doctor, it's not bothering me. Well, when did you have the abortion? About 10 years ago. Tell you what, you go home, ask God if it was, a boy or girl, and write a letter to that child and bring it back tomorrow. And if you're not bothered by it, then that'll be easy to do. Well, she came back the next day, and we recognized it was a huge trauma, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But that was a key because it was so packaged neatly away. It was like she couldn't even imagine that could be affecting her today. Some people are really surprised by this, aren't they, Lana?
Yeah. Yeah, they are. I agree. I think they have a hard time, or, there's a lot of, well, that was a long time ago.
Yes.
I'm a different person now, and just kind of forgetting that's just not the way that the body and the brain work. It just doesn't work that way.
It doesn't. That adage of time heals all wounds is really wishful thinking. We find out that it's not really true, right? I mean, honestly, if we read the scripture, it's like God heals all wounds, but he shows us how to do it. I mean, we have to bring things into the light, we have to reason together, and we have to invite that truth and light from him to come in. But what are some other things that you find really help along the process of healing and helping people with trauma?
So part of my ministry work that I do is with SRA individuals, which are satanic ritual abuse.
Right.
And so, in that sphere, that's really tough, right? Because they have been harmed in a way that also has placed, it's almost like everything that we know to be, up is down for them, and everything that's down for them is up for them, And so much of that is helping to bring back in truth, find truth, right? Give them a set of belief about themselves and about God and who he truly is. And then helping them see where the Lord has been, even in the process of the trauma that they've experienced. Right?
That's good.
The Lord does not leave us or abandon us. And even whenever we are in really hard situations, I think that people assume that they were abandoned if the Lord didn't immediately remove them out of that. But he doesn't ever leave. He doesn't ever leave. He's always there. And I do think that a lot of work that I've done with people in those situations is kind of giving them a moment to be in prayer and be mindful and meditate on that and see if they can find a way, even in the scary place that they're in, the scary situation, if they're kind of struggling with a flashback, to to ask, like, can you try to see if you can find Jesus in this space?
Yes. That's so good, Lana. And that I do that in my counseling, with people. We get to that place of trauma and we just remember Jesus said in Revelation 3, I stand at the door and knock. And that passage is not for unbelievers, it's for believers. He was writing to a church of believers at Laodicea, but he was saying you're in denial. And so I think once we come out of denial and we can go to these places where I call it the needy room, where we need him, that he's literally knocking on that door, and by faith we can open that.
That's right.
you know and to me, part of what we have to do is, we have to open the door to the trauma because it's probably been closed, and then we have to deal with the self-contempt or the self-judgment. And eventually, of course, there's a lot of times a perpetrator or someone else you're angry with. How do you approach the anger toward others, especially when there's a really clear perpetrator, Lana?
Yeah. Well, listen, I think that anger can be justified, right?
Hmm.
So it's like
Hmm.
there can be a reason why anger belongs there, you know? So
Yes.
whenever there has been wrongdoing, it's like anger is appropriate. But again, we can get to a place where anger is unhealthy for us, right? Or we're holding on to that. So, if we are really angry, we can talk about how sometimes it's like, well, that's maybe right. You should feel anger about
Hmm.
the situation. Sometimes it takes, I've actually had clients that I knew they should be feeling anger, and that was the last feeling that they wanted to feel towards the perpetrator, right?
Yes.
So we actually had to work to be able to get to a place to be like, yes, I am very angry at
Yes.
this person. And that was okay. And then once we were able to kind of get there, be there, then we had to find the way to then release that anger, right? And then
Yes.
allow the Lord to navigate that, right? And
Hmm.
so that's a big part of that, I think, in terms of like the anger that can come out, because it's while it's necessary, and I think it is a part of healing, I also think that then people can't stay there. And then forgiveness looks different
Right.
too, right? So it's like
Right.
we know that we we are called to forgive, but forgiveness is not always reconciliation, right? And
No.
so,
No.
but so many people get those confused and are
Right.
so terrified of anyone saying the word,
Right.
forgive or forgiveness,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
they then are so concerned that they're
Hmm.
going to have to be forced to bring back in someone who is unsafe back into their lives.
Absolutely. Right.
That's not what we're called to do, you know.
No, it's not.
I love the story of Joseph, where his brothers sold him into slavery,
Hmm.
and he it's like, okay, and then he had challenge after challenge after challenge, but then finally, his brothers come to him, and everyone likes to, be like, and his brothers came, and then he accepted them with welcome arms. That's not true. He
That's
tested
not
them
exactly
multiple
right, is it?
times,
Yeah,
right?
he tested
He
them.
tested them multiple times. He did not speak in the language that he knew he could. He
Right.
continued, right? Like it's like he really stuck to it, even though he knew exactly who
Yes.
they were, because he wanted to see, are you different? Are you also
Hmm.
going to sell out my brother?
Hmm.
What
Hmm.
is happening here? And they proved that that's not who they were.
They did.
And then he was willing to kind of receive them back, right? So I truly believe he had forgiven them long, long, long,
I did
long
too.
ago.
I did
I
too.
mean, and he knew that. He's like, hey, the Lord had a plan for this, right?
Hmm.
But reconciliation did not come until he knew that they were safe.
That's right. That's exactly right. I try to tell my clients that forgiving and trusting are two different things. And that's really what you're saying. I can't reconcile unless there's trust. So, forgiving and trusting, there's an age old saying, right? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
That's right.
And those things become adages because there's so much truth in them,
Mm-hmm.
right? Joseph had wisdom. I don't think there's any evidence, like you say, that he had bitterness towards them, but he clearly didn't trust them as far as he could throw them. So he put them through these tests, and lo and behold, they passed the test. By that time, it's like virtually all of them had some level of conviction about what they had done. And, we talk about getting angry. A lot of my clients, and I don't know if you've noticed this, Lana, but a lot of my clients seem to be they can do mad really well, but not sad very well.
Hmm.
Or they could do sad really well, but not mad. And I find that I'm trying to help them to balance that because I don't know if you've ever thought about it. I tell people all the time, you can't be an imitator of God unless you get mad and sad. He definitely gets mad and he gets sad.
Hmm.
And there's all kinds of scripture for that. And so some people grew up, well, it's a sin to be angry, or only dad could get angry in my house, or whatever it is. And so you have to help them with that sometimes, even to be able to go to that next level of trauma. But the last thing I would say about anger, just as a tip for people, Ephesians chapter 4 says, be angry and yet do not sin. Don't let the sun go down in your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity. So we're actually commanded to be angry. And what are we angry at? Injustice. Anger should be a reaction to a perceived injustice. And if we've buried the trauma, we've buried the anger that goes with it. However, I tell people that anger is like manna. It will feed you on the day you get it. But if you keep it overnight, it will get worms. And that's just a way to think about it, right, Lana?
That's right.
Because,
That's right.
you do have to process it. And we know when you've gone through this trauma, it can take some time to process. I try to help people get to and through that anger so they can release it and not remain the debt collectors against that perpetrator.
That's
But
right.
again, you and I, we're in a position we have to respect people too, because I mean, some of this injustice is huge. So those are, man, we've talked about several of the pieces of working through trauma. Do you want to give like an example, or maybe tell us another piece of working through trauma, or PTSD?
Okay. I had a client recently that she was sexually um, sexually molested by a
Okay.
parent as a child. Then given away to a group home. Finally, kind of found an adoptive family as a teen, but by then she just had a lot of issues,
Hmm.
and did not speak about the trauma that happened to her until she was 40 years old.
Oh wow. Okay.
Um, so did a significant amount of work with that, but it was tough. And then it in the last year or two, her perpetrator became ill and needed her to care for them.
Oh wow.
And so we were like, ooh,
Whoa.
whoa, what are we doing here? Like what
Yeah.
is this? And here's the deal. We prayed about that a lot.
Right.
I think it's
Right.
easy to say no.
Sure. Yeah.
No, you're not doing that.
Yeah.
But
That's
we prayed
that's
it.
our gut. That would be the
That's
gut
right.
reaction,
That's
right?
right.
Don't
That's
do it.
right.
Don't do it.
But the Lord said, "Hey, I think you need to do this,"
Wow.
and they did, and I'll tell you, now it's opened a whole nother level of trauma and flooding that kind of came
Yeah.
from that experience.
Yes.
And that feels difficult because it kind of feels like
Yes.
I was called to do this thing thinking it was going to be good.
Right.
And now I'm in a whole nother wave of trauma and flooding.
Yes.
But I firmly believe in that situation that the Lord did allow that because he knew that there was more kind of refining and work to be done and more healing that
Yeah.
he could bring to her ultimately,
Hmm.
moving forward, if she did allow herself to be in that environment and experience what that would be like. So, I don't know if that was exactly what you were asking, but that's, one of those kind of examples of just like, gosh, like sometimes we just don't know. And that's why each case is so different too, in terms of
Hmm.
how was this person harmed? What does that situation look like? What does the relationship look like? But then making sure that we follow the Lord's lead too.
I think that's a great example, Lana. And I've seen so many times where God will put us in a situation or a circumstance where maybe, like you said, she'd really done some work on it, but there were deeper levels to go. And God seems to be really interested in calling me to a deeper place. Of course, I may be going to church on Sunday and singing songs like I Surrender All or God Take Me Deeper. And then we're still a little surprised or shocked if something like that happens. But
Mhm.
if we believe that, God is sovereign, even over our circumstances, then we have to believe that he's directing us to those places and he really does want us to get a deeper level of freedom. That's kind of the way I approach it. But it doesn't make it easy for the person that's going through that.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. What you said just for a moment, you said you worked with some veterans. I've worked with some veterans. Do you find anything different, if they've literally been to war or been in battle in that kind of way, or is it fairly similar trauma to trauma?
Well, I would say it's a little bit unique, right? Just because,
Okay.
yeah, especially if they've served and kind of seen, some very difficult, hard things, right? Or had to be involved in some of those things, right? So it's like,
Mm-hmm.
Here in the States, we are not necessarily feeling like most of us are in a position where then we are given, we are in battle, where then we
Right.
could be
Right.
taking another's life or, kind of be responsible for people's lives, right? It's
Right.
like that's not just kind of our everyday occurrence.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we
Mm-hmm.
have people that those are some of the positions that they were placed in, there's a heaviness with that, right? That is very difficult. And so some of that too is even just the transition back home, right? Because you start to
Mm-hmm.
live a different life there. And
Very
then coming
different.
back
Yeah.
home, this is a different life. And no
Mm-hmm.
matter how much you try to maybe kind of explain it to, your loved ones, your family members, there's still certain things that you don't necessarily feel like you can share with them,
Yeah.
right? And
Yes.
so it's really important for them to find community that is also veterans
Mm-hmm.
in my opinion, because I just think that it's very, very hard for them to really feel like somebody else can understand it if they really haven't been in a similar situation like that.
Yes.
The other thing I will say too is, one of the big factors about if someone, so if someone is in the same kind of, um, group, and
Mm-hmm.
they witness something horrific and
Right.
then they come back,
Right.
right? Um, one of the strongest determining factor of if that person will have PTSD is if that person had childhood trauma.
That's good to tell people. If they had childhood trauma, because it links to it, doesn't it,
Yes,
Lana?
it does. Yes, it
It's
does.
like, yes, it links to it. Right.
So
Yeah.
that's something that for kind of therapists and those of
Mhm.
us on this side too. It's like, hey, if you know that somebody's been through something as an adult and then they're having PTSD and it's really severe, could it be attached to that incident alone?
Mhm.
It could be. But there's a high likelihood, whether they know it or not, that there might have been some childhood trauma as well.
Absolutely. And, honestly, Lana, I find the same thing in my marriage counseling very consistently is the things that are really hanging them up today is connected with some kind of trauma from childhood.
Yeah,
Either something that was absent, like let's say mom never touched or dad never hugged, or of course something that was present, right? Because we know there's trauma from two different things, either the presence of something that caused real pain or the absence of something they really needed.
that's right.
And so, but no, that's really helpful to consider that link. This has been so good, Lana. But do you have any final thoughts or anything you'd like to wrap up, or there might be another example you want to tie into? Because the floor is yours.
I will say this. I mean, I think whenever, people are really like, hey, I have a loved one that has, PTSD. What can I do? How can I help them?
Right.
Right.
That's good. That's good.
So much of that is trying your best to be supportive, right? Encouraging them, probably, like if they're at that point where you really know that they have PTSD, encouraging them to seek professional help,
Right.
right? There's only so much that you can do. You love them and you care for them, but you can't be their therapist. You can't be, kind of their fixer, and you don't need to be, but be supportive, be loving, try to help them have and create a safe, calm space at home. Now, I understand sometimes home lives can just be crazy, but maybe they have a little room, that can be their room where that can be a calm, safe space, right? So trying to kind of help that person set up those things, I think it's very important. But also as kind of a family member of somebody that maybe is having PTSD, I also want to make sure that they understand that they are also allowed to have boundaries themselves, right? Sometimes when we see somebody else really hurting and we know it's something very horrific, it gets really hard to feel like we can set boundaries ourselves. But that's important, right?
It is.
So I do think that those are just important things for kind of family members, friends to remember, is yes, be supportive, but also keep your boundaries.
I appreciate that, Lana. That's really good. And, I think about the first 4 of the gifts of the Spirit that's in Galatians. I think it's Galatians 5. But the first 4 gifts of the Spirit, and I'll read it from the King James, it's love, joy, peace, long suffering.
That's right.
And I will tell you, if a loved one has went through trauma, just those 4, I know there's 5 more, but even those 4, to be leaning on God to receive those gifts, because love, joy, peace, and long suffering are essential in helping someone. But like Lana said, the caregiver or the loved one, you have to keep your head above water too. And so there's a balance there. Thank you so much, Lana. I so appreciate you coming on. I thank you for your ministry and your counseling. LanaBagleyCounseling.com, and you're a licensed professional counselor, supervisor, and you've got Whole Reach Ministry also. Anything else about how to contact you or how to reach you, Lana?
You can email me if you have any questions or thoughts.
Okay.
The best way to email me is lana@lanabagleycounseling.com.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions or give any resources out there. There's a couple of books that I like to suggest to people. So if you feel like, gosh, we're not ready to start, seeking professional help or, doing whatever else, I would say look for local churches, look for some of those ministry. There's lots of hotlines you could call, but there's also some really good books out there. So
you want to share one of those book titles? Or
Sure. Suffering, by Paul Tripp.
Okay.
Paul David Tripp.
Paul Tripp.
That one's a really, really good one. And then Lisa Turkhurst, hers is It's Not Supposed to Be This Way. Those two are ones that I really like to encourage people to kind of step into a little bit, just with good biblical perspective, but also really recognizing the difficulty and hurt that comes with suffering.
That's so good. We'll put those on the links, and so appreciate you doing this with us. We'll have to try it again sometime. I hope you have a good week, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm Mark at SamaritansWell.com, and that was Lana Bagley. So God bless you. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do us a favor and like, subscribe, and share with others who might need it. And you can find additional resources at SamaritansWell.com.